There are losses that break you cleanly, the way a bone breaks, and there are losses that don't break you at all, but instead hollow you out, so slowly and so completely that by the time you understand what has happened, there is almost nothing left. Johnny Cash knew both kinds. He had spent his entire life learning to live with loss, beginning with his brother Jack when he was 12 years old and continuing through every decade that followed, through addiction and collapse and the slow erosion of the things he had built. But nothing in all those years of loss had prepared him for the morning of May 15, 2003, when June Carter Cash died in a Nashville hospital following complications from heart surgery, and the man who had built his entire second life around her presence was left alone in a world that suddenly contained none of the things that had made it bearable. He was 71 years old. His own health was failing. He had been diagnosed with autonomic neuropathy, a condition that was slowly destroying his nervous system, and the diabetes that had complicated his final years was worsening. He walked with difficulty. His hands shook. The voice that had once filled arenas and prison dining halls and late-night living rooms across America was still there, still recognizable, but it came now from a body that was visibly tired, visibly done with the work of holding itself together against the pressure of time and illness and grief. June had been the structure around which his later life was organized, not just emotionally, though that was the most obvious and most talked about part of their relationship, but practically, functionally, in the daily texture of waking up and moving through a day and finding reasons to keep doing the thing you have always done. She had saved his life once, in the most literal sense, by refusing to let his addiction destroy him in the 1960s when everything else was already falling apart. And she had kept saving it, in quieter and less dramatic ways, for the 35 years of their marriage that followed. Without her, the question of what came next was not just an emotional question, it was an existential one. What happened in the 4 months between June's death in May and Cash's own death in September 2003 is one of the most remarkable final chapters in the history of American music. A man who had every reason to stop, every biological and emotional justification for simply going quiet, chose instead to do the only thing he had ever known how to do when the world became unbearable. He picked up a guitar, he walked into a studio, and he made music that was so honest and so unguarded and so completely without pretense that it stands today as one of the most extraordinary documents of what it feels like to be human at the very end of everything. To understand what Cash lost when June died, you have to understand what she was to him, and that understanding requires going back further than most people go when they tell the story of their relationship. The popular version of Johnny and June is a love story, and it is a love story, but it is also something more complicated and more interesting than that, something that has to do with the particular kind of bond that forms between two people when one of them has saved the other's life and both of them know it. June Carter came from the Carter family, the foundational dynasty of American country music. She was raised in music the way most people are raised in language, absorbing it before she could articulate what it was or why it mattered, carrying it in her body as naturally as she carried her own heartbeat. She was also, by the time she entered Cash's orbit in the late 1950s, a woman of considerable experience and considerable resilience. She had been married twice before, had a son from her first marriage, and had navigated the particular difficulties of being a woman in the mid-20th century music industry with the kind of pragmatic grace that only comes from having no other choice. She first met Cash in 1956 at the Grand Ole Opry, and she saw immediately what most people around him were trying not to see, that underneath the talent and the charisma and the rapidly growing fame, something was wrong. There was a darkness in him that went beyond artistic temperament, a quality of self-destruction that was already beginning to express itself in the erratic behavior and the pharmaceutical dependency that would define the worst years of his life. June saw it, and she did not look away, which was itself an unusual response. Most people in his professional circle either didn't notice or decided it wasn't their problem. June decided it was hers. What followed was not a straightforward rescue story. Cash resisted her interference, sometimes furiously. He was a proud and private man who did not easily accept help, especially help that required him to acknowledge how badly he needed it. June persisted anyway, with a combination of stubbornness and genuine love that was, in retrospect, the only approach that could possibly have worked. She dismantled his access to the pills that were destroying him. She positioned herself as a constant presence in his professional and personal life, making herself indispensable in ways that left him less room to disappear into the darkness. She watched him steadily and without drama through years of relapses and recoveries and the grinding uncertainty of not knowing which direction any given day would go. When they finally married in March 1968, it was the culmination of more than a decade of this particular kind of love, the kind that is built not on romance alone, but on the daily choice to stay, to keep showing up, to refuse to be driven away by the worst a person has to offer. Cash said many times in the years that followed that June had saved his life. He said it so often that it became a kind of formula, something people expected him to say, and as a result, it sometimes didn't land with the full weight it deserved, but he meant it every time, and the people who knew them both confirmed it. Without June, Cash almost certainly would not have survived the 1960s. The 35 years of their marriage were not uniformly easy or uniformly happy, because no 35 years of any marriage are. There were relapses in Cash's addiction, moments when the darkness came back and the progress of years seemed to dissolve overnight. There were the ordinary difficulties of two strong personalities sharing a life, the compromises and negotiations and occasional collisions that any long partnership requires. There were professional pressures and financial uncertainties, and the particular strangeness of aging in public, of watching the world's relationship to your work shift and evolve in ways you can't entirely control. But there was also something in that marriage that people who witnessed it from the inside consistently described as remarkable, a quality of genuine partnership and genuine attention that didn't diminish with time the way it does in many long relationships, but instead seemed to deepen and become more essential. June remained invested in Cash's well-being with the same intensity she had brought to their earliest years together. Cash remained, to a degree that surprised people who knew him only through his public image, genuinely devoted to her, grateful for her in ways that went beyond affection into something closer to reverence. Their son John Carter Cash, born in 1970, grew up watching a marriage that was by any measure unconventional, the touring, the recording sessions, the constant presence of musicians and industry figures, and the particular circus of American celebrity, but that was also, underneath all of that, grounded in a mutual regard that he has described in the years since as the most important thing he learned from his parents. Not the music, not the fame, but the willingness to keep choosing each other, keep showing up for each other, through whatever the years brought. By the early 2000s, both Cash and June were dealing with serious health problems. Cash's autonomic neuropathy was advancing. June had her own difficulties. But they continued to work, continued to perform when they were able, continued to make music together in the home studio in Henderson, Tennessee, where they had recorded much of Cash's remarkable late-career work with producer Rick Rubin. There was a quality to those final years of working together that people who were present for it have described as both beautiful and heartbreaking. Beautiful because of the music they were still capable of making, heartbreaking because of the visible cost at which they were making it, the effort required of two aging and unwell bodies to keep doing what they had always done. June underwent open-heart surgery in May 2003. The surgery itself went as planned, but complications developed in the aftermath. And on May 15, 2003, June Carter Cash died. She was 73 years old. The days immediately following June's death were, by all accounts, a period of profound and disorienting grief for Cash. He had known, on some level, that this was coming. They had both known. The way you know things that you cannot bring yourself to say aloud, but knowing that something is coming and being present for it when it arrives are entirely different experiences, and the difference between them was something Cash had to discover for himself in those first days of May 2003. He did not perform publicly in the immediate aftermath. He could not have. The physical and emotional resources required for performance were simply not available to him in those first weeks, and the people around him were realistic about that. What Cash needed in that period was not a return to work, but simply time to begin the process of adjusting to a world that no longer contained the person who had been its center for 35 years. The house in Henderson, Tennessee that they had shared, the house where they had recorded and talked and built the daily life of a long marriage, was suddenly a different kind of place, full of her absence in the way that only the places we share with people can be full of their absence after they are gone.
People who visited Cash in those first weeks have described a man who was visibly diminished, who sat quietly in rooms that had always been filled with activity and music and the particular energy that June brought to every space she occupied. He ate little, he slept badly, he spent time looking at photographs and at the objects that had accumulated over 35 years of a shared life, the small ordinary things that become unbearably significant when the person associated with them is gone. He talked about June constantly, to his children and to his friends, and to anyone who came to sit with him, as if talking about her was a way of keeping her present, a way of refusing the finality of what had happened. But Cash was not, by nature, a man who found comfort in stillness. He had spent his entire adult life in motion, on stages and in studios and on tour buses, and the particular kind of thinking he did best was the kind that happened while he was making something. The grief was immense, but underneath it, or perhaps alongside it, was an impulse that was as old and as fundamental as anything in him, the impulse to make music, to take whatever was inside him and find a way to put it into a form that could be heard. He had done it after Jack's death, transforming that grief into the darkness that underpinned everything he ever recorded. He had done it after his first marriage collapsed, after the years of addiction, after every significant loss. Music was not his escape from those experiences. It was his way of going deeper into them, of following them to wherever they led, and reporting back. He began, tentatively at first and then with gathering determination, to record. His producer Rick Rubin, who had collaborated with Cash since 1993 and who had overseen the remarkable American recording series that had restored Cash's creative reputation in the final decade of his life, was supportive and present. The sessions that followed June's death were unlike anything Rubin had experienced in his career, and his career had contained an extraordinary range of experiences. Cash came to the studio, and he sang with the kind of openness that most performers spend their entire careers trying to achieve and almost never do, the openness that comes not from technique, but from having nothing left to protect. In the 4 months between June's death and his own, Cash recorded more than 50 songs. Not all of them were completed, and not all of the completed ones were released, but the body of work he produced in that period is staggering both in its quantity and in its quality. It is the work of a man who understood, with the clarity that serious illness and serious grief can sometimes produce, that he did not have much time left, and that the time he had needed to be spent doing the only thing that had ever truly mattered to him. The sessions were not easy. Cash's physical condition made recording difficult in ways that would have stopped a less determined man. His hands shook. He tired quickly. Some days the voice that had always been his most reliable instrument was rough in ways that required multiple takes to get through a single song. But Cash did not stop, and Rubin did not suggest that he should. There was an understanding between them, unspoken but completely clear, that what was happening in those sessions was too important to be interrupted by the ordinary logistical concerns of recording, that the music Cash was making in those months was worth whatever it cost to make it. Some of the recordings from this period are almost too painful to listen to, not because Cash's voice had deteriorated, it hadn't, not entirely, not in the ways that matter most, but because of what is present in the voice, the weight of everything he had lived and everything he had lost. When he sang about love and loss and the approach of death in those final sessions, he was not performing those subjects in the way a younger man or a healthier man might perform them, giving them shape and beauty while maintaining a certain protective distance from their full reality. He was inside them, completely and without reservation, and the recordings capture that with a fidelity that makes them difficult to hear and impossible to forget. He sang like the 309, a darkly funny song about wanting his body shipped home by train, with the kind of wry acceptance of death that had always been part of his artistic character. He sang old hymns that he had known since his mother sang them in the kitchen in Kingsland, Arkansas, returning at the end of his life to the music that had been there at the beginning, the gospel sounds that had first taught him what music was capable of. He sang love songs that were addressed, unmistakably, to June, songs in which the past tense and the present tense blurred together in the way they do when you are trying to talk to someone who is no longer there to hear you. The American V, 100 Highways album assembled from these final recordings and released posthumously in 2006, opens with Help Me, a plea for divine assistance that carries in it not just faith but doubt, not just prayer but the knowledge that prayer may not be answered, the full complexity of a man who had believed all his life and who was now testing that belief against the hardest possible circumstances. It is not a comfortable recording. It was not meant to be. Cash had spent his entire career making music that refused to be comfortable, that insisted on looking at the difficult things directly rather than looking away, and he was not about to change that in the final months of his life. He had earned the right to that discomfort, and he used it. Cash's children, the 4 daughters from his first marriage to Vivian Liberto and his son John Carter Cash with June, were present through those final months in various capacities, and the accounts they have given in subsequent years paint a picture of a man who was simultaneously devastated and determined, who was grieving as deeply as any person could grieve, and who was also in some essential way still himself, still the man who had walked into Folsom Prison alone with a guitar and the conviction that music was worth making regardless of what anyone else thought about it. His daughter Rosanne Cash, who is herself a gifted songwriter and who has written about her father with exceptional insight and honesty, has described those months as a period in which Cash seemed to be in conversation with death in a way that was not exactly peaceful, but was not exactly fearful either. He had thought about mortality his entire life, had built his music around the awareness of it, had worn black for decades as a statement of solidarity with everyone who was living under its shadow. The approach of his own death was in some ways simply the fulfillment of a subject he had been preparing to address his whole career.
John Carter Cash has written about sitting with his father in the studio during those final recording sessions, watching him sing, understanding that what he was witnessing was something that would not come again. He has described his father's voice in those sessions as sounding like it came from a place beyond ordinary performance, from somewhere deeper and more essential, as if the stripping away of everything else that had accompanied his illness and his grief had left only the most fundamental and most true version of what Johnny Cash had always been, a man with a guitar and something real to say. Cash talked to his children in those months about June, about what she had meant to him and what he wanted them to understand about her, about the nature of the love they had built over 35 years and the debt he felt he owed her for what she had given him. He talked about Jack, too, as he always did when he was trying to make sense of the big things, reaching back to that Arkansas sawmill and that hospital room, and the 12-year-old boy who had held his dying brother's hand and learned in the worst possible way what it meant to lose someone irreplaceable. He told his children that he was not afraid, that he missed June every hour of every day, and that the missing was not going to get better, but that he was not afraid. Johnny Cash died on September 12, 2003, less than 4 months after June. The official cause of death was respiratory failure due to complications from diabetes. He was 71 years old. He had spent the last weeks of his life in the hospital, unable to record, unable to perform, but still, by the accounts of those who were with him, still himself, still the man who had come from a cotton farm in Arkansas and made himself into one of the most important voices in American music through sheer force of honesty and will. The response to his death was immediate and enormous. Radio stations that had been playing his music since the 1950s ran tributes. Newspapers and magazines ran front-page obituaries. Musicians from every genre spoke publicly about what he had meant to them, about the particular quality of his presence in American music, about the way his voice had always seemed to come from a place that most music was afraid to go. President George W. Bush released a statement. The flags at the Country Music Hall of Fame were lowered to half-staff. But the most meaningful responses came as they had always come in Cash's career, not from the industry but from ordinary people. Letters and messages arrived at the Cash family home and at the offices of his record label from people all over the world who wanted to say what his music had meant to them, who wanted to mark in some way the passing of a voice that had accompanied them through the significant moments of their lives. Many of these messages mentioned June in the same breath, as if the two of them were inseparable in the public imagination, as if losing Cash meant losing both of them again, meant completing the goodbye that had begun in May. The posthumous recordings that were released in the years following his death, American v. 100 Highways in 2006 and American 6, Ain't No Grave in 2010, introduced Cash's final voice to a new generation of listeners who discovered in it something that surprised them, not the voice of a man saying goodbye, but the voice of a man still having something urgent and necessary to say, still insisting on the truth, even when the truth was difficult, still making music that demanded to be heard, rather than simply listened to. There is a recording from the final sessions, a version of the old spiritual Ain't No Grave that has become, in the years since Cash's death, something like a touchstone for people trying to understand what he was doing in those last months. In it, Cash sings about the impossibility of being held by death, about a faith that persists even when everything else is gone, about a voice that cannot be silenced even by the grave. The recording is rough and unpolished in the way that all the final recordings are rough and unpolished, carrying in its texture the evidence of the conditions under which it was made, an old and ill man in a studio, singing because he could not sing. But there is something in it that goes beyond its circumstances, something that reaches beyond the specifics of Cash's situation into a territory that belongs to everyone who has ever tried to hold on to something they were losing. That is ultimately what Cash did in those final months. He did not manage his grief or translate it into something more acceptable. He did not protect his audience from the reality of what he was experiencing. He did what he had always done, what he had done in the dining hall at Folsom Prison in 1968 and in Sun Records Studio in 1955, and in every significant moment of his artistic life, he told the truth. He took the most difficult thing that was happening to him, and he put it into music with as much honesty as he could manage, trusting that the honesty itself was what made it worth hearing. June Carter Cash died on May 15, 2003, and Johnny Cash died on September 12, 2003, and between those two dates, a man who had every reason to go quiet chose instead to keep making music, to keep telling the truth, to keep doing the work that had defined his life from the moment he first picked up a guitar in a German Air Force barracks and discovered that he had something to say and a voice capable of saying it. The music he made in those 4 months is his final gift, and it is, characteristically, not a comfortable gift. It is a difficult and demanding and absolutely honest one. He had been preparing to make it his entire life.